Hello and welcome to Stratford Literary Festival. My name is Clare Clark. We'd obviously hoped to be welcoming you in person this bank holiday weekend, but as we all get used to a new online world, we're very glad to be able to bring you some of this festival's most brilliant programming from our homes directly to yours. So welcome to Stratford Goes Virtual. I'm delighted to introduce Christina Lamb. Currently Chief Foreign Correspondent of the Sunday Times, Christina has worked in war and combat zones for more than 30 years. She's been named Foreign Correspondent of the Year 5 times and has won the prestigious Prix Bayeux for her war reporting. She's also the best-selling author of numerous books, including her latest, the devastating Our Bodies, Their Battlefield, What War Does to Women. Historian Anthony Beevor in The Spectator called it the most powerful and disturbing book I've ever read, while human rights lawyer Amal Clooney described it as a wake-up call to the magnitude and horrors of rape in war. These women's stories will make you weep and then rage at the world's indifference. Christina, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Obviously, we're not meeting in the circumstances that we ideally would have. Lockdown's difficult for all of us, but I imagine it's absolutely life-changing for a foreign correspondent who wouldn't normally be at home like this.
Yes, I was just thinking, actually, I don't remember the last time I've spent this amount of time in one place, I guess when I had a baby. But so it's very different. Normally I would be jumping on a plane, and now I find myself reporting about my own country and my own city of London.
Has that been fun and a good change?
Well, I mean, at the beginning it was frustrating because I felt like we were ignoring, and I still feel that, the rest of the world. I mean, the world hasn't stopped and wars are still going on. A place that I'm really passionate about, Afghanistan, the war is kind of even more than ever. The Taliban have been averaging 50 to 70 attacks a day. And yet at the same time, they're trying to fight coronavirus. Yemen, also lots of fighting, and Libya. So it was frustrating that we're kind of ignoring those things, and also that we're so focused on what's happening here that we're not looking at other countries that are much less well equipped to deal with this situation. However, it is the biggest story that we've probably ever lived through. And it has been actually really interesting talking to people here in the UK about how they're doing. And I suppose in my foreign reporting, I've always been really interested in people at the margins, or people or inequalities and injustice, and how things affect people differently. So in my reporting here, I've been looking, for example, at how lockdown affects people who are living in tower blocks, who don't have gardens to go and sit outside, who don't have lots of laptops for their children to use, who are squashed into a very small space. And that's a very different experience than for people in a house and garden. And also what it means for homeless people. How can you stay home if you haven't got a home? And also some of the groups that are still continuing to work and risking their lives. So for the last week, I've been talking to bus drivers who have been really hit disproportionately, and lots of bus drivers have died, and talking to their families. Because I think I'm concerned that every day at these government briefings, we see these graphs of numbers, and we're just accepting these huge numbers every day, but everyone is a person, and I feel it's become a bit dehumanized. And so I'm trying to put a human face, I suppose, on it.
I mean, that's always been, over the 30 years, more than 30 years that you've been doing your job, that's always seemed to be your very particular focus, is to go beyond the public and maybe even the sort of technical historic record and go into the personal effects of, particularly of war and combat, on women, on the hidden cost of these conflicts. Obviously, this new book is very much about that. How long have you been thinking about a book that talks about very particularly the abuses like rape that that women are subjected to during war?
I think there was kind of two things that were going on in my head that led me to do this. One was that I felt that when we covered these stories, or when histories were written about conflicts, that often the role of women was left out, and it was very much focused on the men. And when there were peace negotiations at the end of conflicts, it tended to be very male, almost as if the women weren't involved. And yet in my reporting, I've always been much more interested in the people who are not actually doing the fighting, but the people trying to live as we are now in coronavirus time, you know, what it's like to live in that situation and to keep your life together and feed and educate your children. So that was what always fascinated me much more than the bang bang. But at the same time, as feeling concerned that women were being written out of history, I also felt that the brutality against women in war seemed to be getting worse in the last few years. And that seemed very difficult for me to comprehend why that should be. And so starting really with the Yazidi girls and women who were taken by ISIS and held as sex slaves in Iraq and Syria, with, you know, the most awful stories of what happened to them, being sold from one to another. One girl that I met was sold on 12 times, and being kept in these kind of slave markets and divided into ugly and beautiful and traded as if they were goats. And then shortly after that, I was spending quite a lot of time in northern Nigeria, where you may remember 6 years ago now, the Chibok girls were taken from their school in the middle of the night, more than 200 of them, by Boko Haram fighters, and forced to be what they call bushwives. And that at the time attracted a lot of interest, and people all over the world, were world leaders and celebrities were holding up those "Bring Back Our Girls," doing selfies and using that hashtag. But when I was in northern Nigeria investigating it, I mean, there were tens of thousands of girls being taken, and this was really just the tip of the iceberg. And they had terrible stories. And then shortly after that, so this was all within the space of a couple of years, then there was the Rohingya crisis, where women in Burma were attacked by Burmese military and Buddhist militias, who tied them to banana trees and then gang raped them, often in front of their children. And on a massive scale, I mean, around 700,000 people fled into Bangladesh. And I mean, every woman that I spoke to in every crossing the border or in the shelters where they were put had the most awful stories. So, you know, it seems to be one thing after another. And of course, I wrote about these things for my newspaper at the time, but it didn't seem to be making enough difference. And so because of that, I really became quite obsessed with why is this happening and wanting to know what anybody was doing about it.
Mm. And I mean, one of the points you make very clearly in the book is how these rapes weren't just, as perhaps I might have guessed before reading your book, a sort of byproduct of war, almost the sort of spoils of soldiers, but something much more deliberate and systematic, a sort of strategy, if you like, a strategy of war rather than just a sort of unfortunate byproduct.
Yes, I mean, one of the things when I talk to people about my book, lots of people said, oh, well, there's always been rape in war, you know, sort of rape and pillage, and as though it should be something acceptable. Well, first of all, just because something may have gone on since Roman and ancient Greek times, I don't think necessarily means that in this day and age we should find it acceptable. But secondly, as you just mentioned, the cases that I was looking at, it wasn't just sort of people taking advantage of the chaos of war. It was actually people being told or ordered to do this as a weapon, and it's an extremely effective weapon, unfortunately.
Because some of the things that I was very interested about was that, obviously the ISIS fighters were told that it was their religious duty to take the Yazidi as slaves, weren't they?
Yes, absolutely. So you have numerous examples like that where people, I mean, in their case, they were told it was their religious duty. It's sort of different from place to place. I mean, in some places like Boko Haram in Nigeria, it was also a way of keeping young fighters sort of, because they weren't paid, and so providing them with a wife who normally they would have had to have money for a bride price was also some way of keeping them on side. And then you have places like Congo where you have militias trying to get hold of, control different areas because those areas have mineral wealth. And I'm afraid a lot of the things that we need for modern day, like we're using now, I'm using an iPad to speak to you, require things that are mined in the DRC, and those things are worth a lot of money. And so the militias want to take control of those areas, and an effective way of doing it is terrorizing people by raping all the women and making the communities, decimating the communities and making them leave.
I mean, the absolutely awful thing, of many awful things, but one of the most devastating cumulative feelings one gets from the book is how these women suffer multiple times, because it's not only that they are treated so appallingly, but also their own communities, as you say, and often their own families go on to consider them shamed or dishonored and reject them accordingly. That was very shattering to me, to realize how these women were held responsible for their own treatment.
Yeah, I found that very difficult. I mean, these women are victims, but they've become victims over and over again because they are, as you say, they castigated, they're ostracized from their communities. So having gone through this terrible ordeal, and this ordeal, in many cases it's rape, but it may be gang rape, it may also be like setting fire to their vagina or shooting through their, just absolutely horrendous things. So they've gone through this terrible physical ordeal and mental suffering, and then their own communities and families won't take them back because they believe that they bring shame upon them. And so in some cases, for example, some of the young women in the camps in Nigeria who have been freed from Boko Haram, then their communities won't take them back. So they have no way of surviving. And the only way that they can survive is often to sleep with camp officials who will then give them food. And so you just, the cycle, what they're going through. And some of them then feel that they would prefer to go back to Boko Haram, which is just awful. And we're seeing, actually, I was most recently, just before lockdown, was in South Sudan, which is another place which has had really high levels of war rape. And some of the women who'd been captured and kept as sex slaves had, the church had negotiated releasing some of them, and so had taken them for a couple of weeks to sort of work with them. And at the end, the women all said, well, we're going back to the, and that was partly also because they were terrified that the men would come and find them and kill them. But they also felt that their communities would see them as something that had somehow been sullied. And that's so wrong, because these women are the ones who are the victims, and yet they're being blamed for what happened to them.
And often their rapists are their neighbours and in their villages and things too, aren't they? So they're going back to live alongside the people who who treated them so abhorrently in the first place.
Well, that's why it's often so difficult to get justice, because, you know, you're asking women. So I believe justice is the most important thing actually in changing this. But in some places, you are asking women to try and get justice against people who are actually running the country, maybe their own army or police that are doing this, or local militias who are living among them and have all the weapons. So how could a woman then try and seek justice? It's extremely difficult. And that's why they need support from outside.
Yeah, and it was clear that I mean, obviously you were very had reservations about getting women to talk about these experiences. I mean, you write very evocatively here, I was torn between the journalistic desire to know, the fear of what she might say. This was a woman taken as a slave by ISIS. And above all, the concern that telling me her story would bring her more grief. And I think the conclusion that you come to is that the women will talk as long as they feel it will change something.
Yeah, I mean, I was extremely concerned about re-traumatizing people by making them talk about these things. And I actually, in the book, really, they were a sort of self-selected group in that I didn't go to random women in places and say, hey, have you been raped? What's your story? You know, like that apocryphal, anyone here been raped and speak English? Or perhaps apocryphal. It was much more that I went through people working with them. So if there was an organization in a Yazidi camp which was helping them seek justice, so they asked women first, you know, there's this journalist and are you prepared to speak to her? And some women I started speaking to, and then they said, actually, you know, I find this too difficult, and that's fine. But you know, actually most of them were really brave and, you know, really wanted to tell their stories because they didn't want this to happen to anybody else. And I think that it's very difficult, you know, the Yazidis, for example, everybody knows what happened to them, right? We know that they were kept as sex slaves by ISIS. We've heard terrible stories, and yet there hasn't been a single prosecution. And they find that really difficult because they feel like we went through all the trauma of telling this story, and yet it hasn't made any difference.
Yes, in terms of the law as a weapon, I mean, while rape was first established, I think, as a war crime after World War I, it's been a very, very slow process, hasn't it, to get both rape as an act of genocide sort of established in law, but also to secure any sort of prosecution.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, we know that in the Second World War, women were taken by the Imperial Japanese Army across Southeast Asia and kept as comfort women for the soldiers. We know that lots of women in Germany were raped by Russian soldiers. I mean, the estimates are of 2 million women. And yet, we had international tribunals at the end of that war, we had Nuremberg, we had the Tokyo Tribunal, and yet there weren't any cases. And it was as if that didn't matter, that the only thing that mattered was the killing. And yet every woman that I spoke to said to me, I would rather have died, that this is worse, living with this. And I think that part of this is because these processes have been very male, and so they haven't thought about what these women are going through. And even today, we are seeing with the ISIS soldiers and fighters, rather, who have been captured in large numbers in Iraq and Syria. And there are lots of prosecutions going on in Iraq. It's not justice as we might know it. They're very quick cases, you know, 20 minutes or less, and somebody's sentenced to death. But they are all being tried for terrorism, not for what they did to the Yazidi women. And when I spoke to the chief judge at one of the two courts, about that. He said he almost was laughing, like, why would we bother doing that? They were killing people. And you can see again and again, I mean, the first place, interestingly, where there was ever a conviction for rape as a war crime was in Rwanda. It was in the tribunal in Arusha, set up to investigate what happened in Rwanda, only just over 20 years ago. And initially, that case, which was of a mayor of a small town called Taba, not far from Kigali, that case was not about rape. But one of the women who was testifying said something like, she did it, and then I was raped. And the prosecutor literally said, well, we're not interested in that, moving on. Fortunately, one of the judges was a female judge from South Africa. And she said, hang on a minute, this woman's come all the way here to testify, and let's just hear what actually happened. So she started asking more questions and discovered that all these women had been raped. And then other women then testifying also said the same thing. So then they actually stopped the case and then changed the charges. And it seems to me more than a coincidence that in almost every case where there's been a conviction anywhere in the world, there has been a female judge.
I mean, it's very clear that pattern is shown, but it's also true that this is a story of extraordinary individuals standing up too, isn't it? I mean, that throughout your book, again and again, we encounter incredible people sort of standing up against this sort of overwhelming tsunami of abuse and horror and saying, no, enough, I'm going to do something.
The courage of these women was so humbling, because to go and speak publicly, and in some cases, for example, in Guatemala, these grandmothers testified about what had happened to them in the civil wars. They were not they were young women then, but this has all taken like 36 years. And I mean, they testified over and over again. They had to tell their story 22 times of what they'd gone through. And the courage to do that, and the bravery, tenacity, and determination is just amazing. And that the only reason really that there have been any convictions anywhere is because of incredible bravery of women, as this case in Rwanda, when these particular 5 women went and told their story, risking their lives. I mean, one of the women involved, her husband and son were killed to try and stop her doing this. So it's really, really difficult, and that's why they need support. And I don't want to be completely negative, because there have been some developments in recent years, and there have been cases, but they tend to be in national courts. So the International Criminal Court, which should be like the model for this, because they don't have to face pressures of living somewhere where they're being harassed by militias or anything. They haven't convicted a single person. The only one that they convicted, Bemba from the DRC, they then reversed the judgment and acquitted him. So that's a terrible example, and I find that very shocking. So the only few cases there have been generally national courts, and largely it seems almost a matter of luck that, for example, now there is a new development, which is in Germany, which Amal Clooney is involved in the case of an ISIS fighter and his wife who captured a Yazidi woman and her daughter, and the 13-year-old daughter died. She was chained up outside their house in Fallujah in extreme heat and died of thirst. And so the mother is now a refugee in Germany. And by luck, through a journalist finding a discarded mobile phone in Syria, which was an ISIS phone, they managed to track down the German woman who had been married to this ISIS fighter. And then he was found by luck in a Greek refugee camp, and so has now been extradited. So there's now a case. But, these are kind of like just small examples, which has either been through great courage and determination or luck. There's no kind of like institutional model or movement that is really changing things. And that's what I think we need.
I mean, people talk about the difficulty of collecting evidence, don't they, in a war situation, even though in macro terms everybody knows what's going on. You know, the stuff that happened with the Serbian army was really well documented. But is there a problem with the way we approach rape, particularly legally, because of the very particular types of DNA evidence and things that we need, that makes this a very difficult, you know, it's hard enough to prosecute a rape in the UK when someone's been given a rape kit straight away afterwards and all that. Is part of this the way we approach rape, do you think, in a legal context?
Well, as you say, I mean, actually, in this country, we had the lowest level of convictions since they started recording that. So, you know, that's not great. It's difficult for anywhere to, I mean, it's difficult for a woman to go and try and bring a prosecution. The evidence can be difficult. That evidence collecting, of course, is much harder in some of these countries. I mean, I was talking to a woman who works in forensics here, and she was talking about, you know, they would normally, if a woman came in who alleged rape, they would spend 4 hours kind of collecting samples and tests and things in they just don't have the capacity to do that in many of the places. But I think, you know, and that is true, that it's difficult, and they don't have the police capacity, they don't have the court capacity. All of these things are difficult, but that doesn't excuse how few cases, even with Bosnia, where, you know, it was very well documented, as you said, there's remarkably few convictions actually, and a lot of the people who are carrying out these things is still wandering around. And there's this brave group of Bosnian women who are trying to track down the men that raped them, and they've been quite successful. They've found more than 100 of them, but you kind of feel like it shouldn't have been down to this group of women to do this. It should have been done anyway. And I think most people were surprised that actually, for all the outrage that there was at the time, that there weren't more legal actions on the rapes and convictions.
I mean, there does seem to be a sort of a turning of a blind eye, or at least a sort of swooping of interest, and then a sort of rushing off to the next thing. You know, you mentioned Boko Haram and Bring Back Our Girls, where for 2 weeks or something, that was the only story there was, and then suddenly the media circus moved on. What do you think the international community needs to be doing differently to keep attention on these things, so that that doesn't happen, so it doesn't, people's you know, experiences aren't just sort of washed away by the news cycle?
Yeah, well, it is endlessly sidelined. And I think part of it is, and I see this as a journalist, that it's uncomfortable. It's a thing people don't want to know about. I mean, I know that my book is difficult to read, some of the stories. But I don't think that because things are difficult and uncomfortable that we should just ignore them. This is a war crime. It should be prosecuted. And I found, you know, difficulty often getting these stories in my newspaper, because there's this feeling that people don't want to read about this. I don't think that's true. I think people do want to know. And I mean, just as I was talking at the beginning about things I'm covering here, I am a huge believer in the sort of power of a story. I think that, you know, often these places and issues seem very, very far away, but once you actually start reading a narrative of a person and what they've actually gone through and how they care about the same kind of things as we do, then, you know, that starts to bring it home. And, you know, maybe with coronavirus, we've seen how all of a sudden your life can change dramatically. We've got quickly used to this strange new normality of wearing masks and trying to avoid each other on the pavement, but also, you know, maybe being nicer to each other and thinking about people that we didn't think about before. And so I think in the same way that hearing the stories of these women and spreading the stories, but also realizing the enormous scale that this is happening. And I'm not just talking about a few countries. When I started investigating this, I went to 4 different continents where this is all happening, and it's continuing to happen as we speak in many places. And until politicians in our countries start saying this isn't acceptable, then I'm afraid that it's going to continue. So we need to give more support and help to these countries to help their legal system and their evidence collecting, and but also make clear that this isn't acceptable, and that we won't deal with countries that are turning a blind eye to things like this. And the UK actually, was a leader in this. And William Hague, when he was Foreign Secretary, set up this unit, which was the first time any foreign office anywhere had created a unit about sexual violence, preventing sexual violence in conflict. And he held this conference with Angelina Jolie, which lots of people from all over the world came. Now, there's been criticism saying much more money was spent on the conference than actually doing anything on the ground. And also the unit has been kind of decimated from what he created to subsequent foreign secretaries, not least our current prime minister, have been less interested in the issue. And it's ended up with, instead of having 45, 50 people working on it, I believe there are like 2 or 3 now. So it's not getting the same importance. I mean, William Hague became so obsessed about it that he said to me, every bilateral he had with any foreign secretary from anywhere, he raised the issue. And so that everybody knew that if you're going to have a bilateral with the British foreign minister, you're going to be asked about that, which means that they had to actually kind of look into what was happening. And, that's at least a start. And it's a shame that that sort of dropped out. I would like to see again that same kind of focus, and maybe it's something that there's been like discussion about, are women leaders better at dealing with a crisis like coronavirus? I mean, maybe if we have more women leaders, it is something that would be taken more seriously, because there's no doubt to me that having more women judges is making a difference, and women prosecutors. It's not to say that, all men are not interested or involved. And in fact, some of the heroes in my book are male. So, but it does seem to be something, because we can all, identify in, well, we can't imagine because it's just unimaginable, but thinking about what it would be like to be dragged from your house and tied up to a tree and raped in front of your small children.
And do you think that the Me Too movement, you referenced the Me Too movement as a sort of galvanizing force for you for thinking about these issues? Do you think that has changed anything culturally in terms of our appetite to deal with issues of abuse of women?
Yeah, I mean, the Me Too movement, is a good thing, and definitely made people more aware and more discussion of these issues. And in fact, the Nobel Peace Prize went to Denis Mukwege, who is one of the heroes in my book, this amazing doctor in Congo who has treated like 54,000 rape victims and risked his life endlessly to talk about this around the world. And so he shared it with Nadia Murad, the Yazidi woman, who was the first Yazidi woman really to go public about the terrible things that she had gone through. So there is more awareness, but I think we must also bear in mind that it's very different being a woman in affluent society where you have access to lawyers and the media than being in a country where there's lots of repression and where people may not have any access to legal representation. And as I said, the people carrying out these terrible things may in fact be running the country or friends with those running the country. We know it's hard enough to bring these cases in our countries. I mean, the women that bravely spoke against Harvey Weinstein, it took years to come out, and then actually, and some of them were castigated at the beginning, and it's extremely difficult. But when Harvey Weinstein was convicted earlier this year, I read one columnist say the age of sexual impunity is over or is dead. Well, I'm afraid that's not true in much of the world. In much of the world today, the body of a woman is a battlefield. They are being used as a weapon of war. And I think that those of us who do have access to media and lawyers and lobbying our politicians owe something to these women to talk about it and to try and raise this issue.
Well, their testimonies are absolutely extraordinary, and you've produced a brave and devastating book. I could go on talking to you for ages, but I'm afraid I think we are running out of time. So I think I'm going to have to wrap it up here. It just remains for me to basically say that your brilliant and important book, which I would commend to everybody, is available through the link on the Stratford Goes Virtual page. And of course, there are other interviews with other of our authors on that page to download there. It just remains to me to say a huge thank you to you, Christina, for joining us and for sharing some of your experiences. And thank you to everyone too for watching. We will see you all at our winter festival in November, and please stay safe. Thanks very much.
Thank you.